We now take a break from our regularly scheduled coffee videos and the various origins of coffee to the different flavors of human culture found around the world. Does it ever seem to you that American kids are lazier than those born elsewhere? Is it any coincidence that Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old with Asperger's and a message for the environment, rose to prominence in Sweden rather than Turkey? Do your Indian parents just not understand the idea of dating? Why did Ireland take until 2019 before abortion was available? Why did the civil rights movements for so many groups of people in America catch fire in the 60s and not before? Why were countries like China and Israel able to implement stringent COVID lockdowns while Sweden and the US had such harsh resistance to them? The origins of the Inglehart-Welzel Cultural Values Map lie on the World Values Survey, and the origin of the World Values Survey lie on the European Values Survey. The motivation was to explore how technological and economic development affected the values and motivations of the public. The survey included questions like, how important is God in your life? Is abortion justified? Is homosexuality justified? And would you ever sign a petition? The interest grew and scope broadened until 95 countries had been included by the seventh wave of surveys covering 6 continents. It was thought that as countries developed economically, their values would follow a predictable path towards modernity, less religion, more tolerance of diversity, and more varied family structure. This turned out to be partially true. But how can you take a long list of questions and make enough sense of it to decide whether or not countries are following the same path? You'll have to whittle it down to the main values these questions are reflecting using something called factor analysis. The basic idea is this. Suppose I'm trying to get clothes tailored. I've noticed when I get pants hemmed, they only ever measure one leg, since measuring the second leg would be redundant. Whether they measure the left leg or the right leg, there's only one thing going on here for both. It's how tall I am. I could go even further and note that when someone comes in to get pants hemmed, there's a pretty good chance they'll want to get their shirt sleeves shortened as well. Again, it's all coming down to one factor causing everything, how tall I am. Now, if I'm in the pants business, I will have to throw another factor in there, which is how wide each person is. But this long list of measurements, the length of each leg, how wide to make each pant leg, the size of the belt loops, can be whittled down to 2 factors causing everything. Factor analysis is the process of using linear algebra to extract how many independent factors are really there. For example, how important is God in your life is a very good predictor for the answer to, is abortion justified? Do you believe people should respect authority? And do you have pride in your country? Inglehart and Welzel ran factor analysis on data from the World Values Survey and found that 70% of the variation across countries could be accounted for in just 2 factors. 2 factors is very convenient because it means it can be graphed. These 2 dimensions are the traditional to secular rational values, depicted on the vertical axis, and survival to self-expression values, shown in the horizontal. Traditional values are mostly about who you listen to, your parents, authority, organized religion, and God. If you have traditional values, you are categorically against abortion, divorce, euthanasia, suicide, and in favor of male-dominated economic and political life, and think a child's job is to make their parents proud. You emphasize family ties, and you don't discuss politics. What Inglehart and Welzel call secular rational values are the opposite of that. Secular rational values find divorce, abortion, euthanasia acceptable, and are less likely to have attended religious services. It is the case that as countries develop economically, they do shift towards secular rational values away from traditional values. Though even more strongly than GDP per capita, this transition is correlated with the fraction of the workforce employed in manufacturing. The explanation given is that as a country shifts away from agrarian work, its people are less at the whims of nature for their livelihood, and so religious practice is less necessary, for their livelihoods are less at the whims of nature. Notably, people do not stop searching for meaning in life and do not become less spiritual. They are just less likely to go to a religious institution and make God a part of that journey. The transition to secular rational values has been described as, quote, essentially replacement of religion and superstition with science and bureaucracy as the basis of behavior and authority relations in a society. But a country turning away from religious traditional values as its economy develops is only one piece of the puzzle. You may have noticed that, among wealthy nations, some have civil rights, while others not so much. Enter the horizontal axis on the Inglehart-Welzel map. The left edge of the horizontal axis has been coined survival values. If the traditional to secular axis is about who or what you listen to, the horizontal axis might be thought of as what you're willing to say. Survival values are characterized by valuing physical and economic security over self-expression and quality of life. Societies with survival values have lower levels of trust, and their inhabitants are less likely to rate themselves as happy, sign a petition, approve of homosexuality, or be satisfied with their financial situation. Survival values people are more likely to favor communist-style state ownership of industry, to have never recycled or been concerned about the environment, and to believe that it's more important to inculcate a strong work ethic in children rather than instill tolerance and creativity. Survival values include strong agreement with the statement, "A woman needs to have children to feel fulfilled," and rejecting foreigners, gays, or people with AIDS as neighbors. The opposite of survival values is self-expression values. If the list of qualities here in survival values is making you uneasy, it's probably because you hail from a liberal Western democracy. Indeed, one aspect of self-expression value is increased demand for decision-making, i.e., having a democratic government that you can participate in. But living in a country with strong self-expression values is the exception in the world. Of the top 10 most populous countries in the world, which together represent over half the world's population, only the US is significantly into the self-expression end of things. Less than 20% of the world lives in a, quote, developed country, unquote. What's been found is that as countries develop economically, they also tend to shift towards self-expression values away from survival values. Even more strongly than GDP per capita is the correlation between self-expression values and what fraction of the country is employed in the service sector. If you're not farming or manufacturing things, chances are you're in the service sector of the economy. The explanation is that since your job places an emphasis on social contact, interacting with diverse humans becomes the basis for your values. The reason the left edge of this axis has been termed survival values is the emphasis is on surviving, having enough resources and stability to go around. A travel boast story, if you will. Getting back to the topic of coffee, I was traveling around Ethiopia, where I learned that the government essentially has an internet kill switch. Whenever they feel like it, they can simply shut down the internet and social media, smothering dissent. Outraged by the seemingly fascist stifling of free speech, I asked my tour guide if that didn't bother him. His reply surprised me. He said, "Sometimes people abuse free speech. They use it to stir up trouble." This response baffled me until I realized that Ethiopia has never been able to take its societal stability for granted. Not being able to take to Facebook to complain to your friends is kind of a first world problem. To this day, Ethiopia has been dealing with increasing ethnic strife, including ethnically motivated mass murder of civilians. So, without further ado, let me present the Inglehart-Welzel Cultural Map of the world. Looking at the map, Inglehart and Welzel have followed Samuel Huntington's lead in noting the various clusters of the countries into cultural zones, wherein the dominant religious culture tends to cause countries to have similar values. It's not so much the active practice of these religions that causes this effect, but legacy effects of the ways the religions have influenced the dominant institutions in these cultures. Notably, the US inherits its cultural values from England, as we've modeled most of our early institutions off of their British counterparts. Shared languages transmit shared cultural values. But the shining beacon of modernity, we are not. If modernity means secular rational values and self-expression, that distinction belongs to the small Islamic Nordic countries, which brings me to my point about Greta Thunberg being taken seriously. Caring about the environment is a luxury indulged by the self-expression world, as is having the notion that children's passions, creativity, and self-advocacy should be valued over simply teaching them good work ethic. Thinking that women can make good leaders is a value of the secular rational world. Valuing diversity and the rights of minorities, whether they be racial, ethnic, religious, or simply not neurotypical, is a strong self-expression value. Looking at the cultural values map, Sweden was the best possible place a message like Greta's from a person like Greta could stick. Maybe collectively an auditorium full of Greta Thunberg-like children have stood up to protest climate change in more traditional countries, and they've simply been told, "You're a child, stop your complaining and get back to work." Even in a very modern place with a developed economy like Japan, it's hard to imagine the cultural milieu supporting this kind of youth empowerment. So why did civil rights movements for blacks, gays, and women all take place in the 60s? Professor Inglehart himself notes that this was a manifestation of self-expression values made possible by a generation growing up under no real specter of war, a generation with existential security and stability.
We can trace this. There was a slow process where the people born after World War II were born under conditions much more secure than those who'd gone through World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. I think 20 years after World War II, in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a new generation emerging, a post-war generation. There was a consciousness of a big gulf between the values of the post-war generation and everyone older. And they were pushing for many of the liberalizations that we see now, gender equality, environmental protection, rights of foreigners, gays, lesbians, a sort of liberation and opening up a more tolerant society.
He and Baker also note that in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, many former USSR countries shifted left towards survival values in reaction to the stability being suddenly pulled out from under them. Self-expression values mean your problems are first world problems. They're the very top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And lastly, why were China and Israel able to implement harsh COVID lockdowns, but many in the US and Sweden decry even a mask mandate as government tyranny? Your Facebook feed may have led you to believe that it's about stupidity, but again, look to self-expression versus survival. Survival value countries tend to be more collectivist, subordinating the needs of the individual to benefit for society. And recall that survival values means doing this without even complaining. Stringent civil rights have a lot of benefits, but ability to implement a massive centralized public health initiative that severely limits personal freedom is not one of them. But China has developed economically to relative material wealth. So have Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Yet even as they've matched Western levels of GDP per capita, the new generations continue to embrace the relatively collectivist survival values. What gives? Inglehart and Baker show using dummy variables that Huntington's cultural zones do have real explanatory power, and the persistence of differences into the modern age show that modernization is path-dependent. Rather than all culture converging into a worldwide modern monoculture, different countries take parallel tracks based on their histories. Bomhoff and Gu show that in a 2012 paper that even connections in self-expression between societal trust, tolerance of gays, and support of democracy don't hold up the same way in the East. Now, a quick caveat. The Cultural Values Map should not be used to stereotype individuals from its respective countries. It represents an average tendency across at least 1,000 people polled per country, and some countries vary enormously within, as a 2021 paper by Akaliski, Bond, and Welzel demonstrates. Group averages tell you almost nothing about individuals. Also, is a nation the appropriate group to be studying? Religious, ethnic, and economic differences have been shown to exist within a country. For example, the average values of American Catholics are different than the average values of American Protestants, though notably, they are closer to each other than American Catholics would be to Mexican Catholics or American Protestants to British Protestants. You might do well to regard any immigrant you've met as atypical of the country simply for the fact that they left their home country, which probably makes them more open, liberal, and ambitious than the norm. What the Cultural Values Map may be used as is a window into the culture the person came from and the kinds of pressures placed on them by society. Akaliski et al. Argue it useful to think of cultural values as a kind of gravitational field that pulls individuals towards compliance with national norms to varying degrees of success. And lastly, these dimensions are human constructs, useful insofar as they are methodologically valid, but Inglehart-Welzel's reduction to 2 dimensions is far from the only method used in sociology. Some argue these two are related and can actually be reduced to 1, while Hofstede uses 6 dimensions that a 2018 paper reduced to 3. I guess you'll just have to travel to really see what's being described here. In terms of bringing self-expression values to other countries, in an interview with Russia Today, Professor Inglehart states that cultural change is slow and cannot be imposed from the outside.
It's not something that happens overnight. I would say, for sure, big cultural changes go slowly. Forcing them on people is likely to produce a reaction.
But that such a change happens organically from within, only after basic security and economic needs have been met.
I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it.
If the goal is freedom and tolerance, the only help that can really be offered is in the form of economic growth and security.
We who have been born and raised in this country don't understand so many other gifts that makes this life so comfortable. These comfortable experiences infuse life with, and as a result, create a space. Because when you don't have anxiety, and when you're not constantly worried, and when you're not fearful, suddenly you realize that your brain has so much more space to think about bigger things and more important things than you used to know.
What about you? Are you an immigrant who has come from a country with different values? Are you an expat or a tourist who has been to a country with different values and something about this model resonates for you? I'd love to hear your comments. Numerous thanks to many international friends for discussing and debating the topics with me. Thanks to Russ Roberts of Econ Talk for use of the clip with Roya Hakakian. And an extra thanks to Dr. Plamen Akaliski for fact-checking this video. Thanks for watching.